So what do you think? I am beginning to experiment with some new intro music. I am easily bored, and so I've been using that music since last March, and so I thought, well, I'll just start playing around with it. And so if you have a visceral reaction for the good or the ill for it, give me a thumbs up on the website or wherever you might hear the podcast. I would love to have the feedback. And so I'm experimenting. I'm experimenting not only with the intro but also the outro music, and so you'll hear something on the back end that will also be a little bit different than you might be accustomed to. I am looking for something that will orient the listener to what we're going to be talking about. So, for what it's worth, I just wanted to get that out there. I am Dr. Ray Mitch, your host. You are listening to the Psych Monologues, which is a podcast that is exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. And welcome to August 1st. By the time you're going to be listening to this, I will be safely ensconced in a high country command post, blithely off the grid. So I'm recording this early so that y'all can get it on the day that you like I said, kind of all six of you that know that it'll come out on a Sunday evening, which is what it's usually scheduled to do. But we're opening a new month, and I look forward to this month. There's a lot scheduled here in the backlog of things that I have not been able to get to throughout the summer, and I've got a couple guests at the very least that I will be interviewing and talking to that I think you'll find entertaining, informative, challenging, all of those things that I think you will find really good for the month. So I have an interesting topic tonight, and I might not be able to get all the way through it, quite honestly, and so I may continue it into the following week. But I went looking on the internet, which I know y'all do. Suddenly the word Google has become a verb. It's like I Googled something, which in any other context sounds ridiculous. But I went looking for quotes that I could find about the topic tonight. And the topic tonight is tension and ambiguity, which I'm sure, like I said, all six of you out there absolutely adore living in tension and living with ambiguity. The interesting thing about this is pretty much everything I found, whether it was quotes or whether it was memes or whether it was all the things that my brain just blinks out on, everything I found suggests that these two qualities are completely negative. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite that was suggested as a benefit. So clarity is the benefit, not ambiguity. And living in tension, what came up was about stress, which makes complete sense, really, because stress is living under tension. So there was not a single one that suggested that ambiguity or tension was a positive thing in people's lives, which is ironic because, after all, we live in tension. As a matter of fact, we probably spend most of our lives pursuing the reduction of tension or ambiguity. Now, let me divide these up and conquer them in one fashion or another. Let me start with tension, because tension is an interesting quality of our lives. I think if you look at how our musculature in our body was designed, it was designed for tension. Many years ago, I had a tragic accident where me and concrete met after a 12-foot fall, and concrete won, in case you were wondering. And I had a fractured femur, and the fascinating thing about that, which some people wouldn't find fascinating, I'm sure, but when they went to repair my femur, they inserted something, and if you get a little queasy over some of this, turn it down for a few minutes. They inserted something called a femoral nail, Nail. It's hardly a nail. It looks more like a rod. And the fascinating thing about that rod, which I keep in my office, I mean, it's titanium, and I've always wondered, if I were to hawk this thing, I mean, yeah, I probably could get enough money to buy a new truck or something. But be that as it may, I have it in my office, partly just to remind me of how central the idea of brokenness is in my life. But I won't get off on that bunny trail. I'll do that another time. But the interesting quality of this femoral nail, which is what the orthopedic surgeons referred to it as, is that it was curved. It wasn't because it was inserted into the interior of my femur, and it was curved. And it was like, wow, that must have been difficult, because generally our femur, it's the longest bone of our body, is pretty straight. And yet they're putting something in there that is curved, which means it probably took a fair amount of effort to get that in there. And a lot of people would say that orthopedic surgeons are a lot like carpenters, which might evoke images that you really didn't want for this evening. But either way, but why? Why is it curved? Because the bone heals better when it's under tension. So what tension is it that you're living in tonight? The tension between what and what? I mean, in the Christian life, there is a tension between grace and truth, for example. There is a tension between telling the truth and living in the truth and living with grace. And those things, the tension itself actually produces the kind of growth that we all are looking for, which, if you take that far enough out, if we're not growing, I think it's a reasonable assumption to make that we probably are doing everything we can to remove the tension that is there, that prompts us to ask the kinds of questions that really need to be asked, that we need to look at within our lives. Because tension rises when things get out of calibration, whether it's in our relationship with God or other people, or even with ourselves. And that one in particular, the relationship with myself, is the one that I pay the least attention to, really. And yet, that's the one that then ripples out to all the other ones. My relationship with others, my relationship with the key people in my life, my relationship to the core relationships in my life, my relationship with God. And so tension itself is seen, and certainly that's true even in our society and culture today, tension is seen as an indication of something bad going on. And yet, tension is the very thing that produces growth. So and that's just a question for you to consider tonight, is what tension do you sense, even as I'm talking? A lot of times when I talk about this, the people that I'm talking to are feeling the tension because I'm talking about it. Because we spend so much of our time really avoiding or looking at it at any length. And so they start feeling the tension, and they start kind of turtling. They kind of go inside and their eyes glaze over. And I know at that point that I'm right where I need to be in terms of what I'm talking about. Because if we refuse to live in the tension between the larger picture of what I mentioned before in terms of grace and truth, between between those two things, and those show themselves in a variety of ways, in a variety of contexts. If I'm trying to get rid of that tension and not live in it, then I probably am going to get sleepy. I'm not going to pay attention to the things that I need to pay attention to in my relationships with the people around me. And that's key. That is key. And so the reality is, and I was talking to a friend of mine this past week, and we were talking about this very thing, between the tension between grace and truth, and he's a all about truth guy, and I know I have come to be known as the grace guy, which I am and I'm not. I think I am in the sense of a true understanding of what grace is, but not in the secular or even the cultural understanding of what grace is, because our understanding of grace is actually to remove the tension. And that's not what grace does. If anything, it empowers us to have the courage to move into the tension that exists within us. C.S. Lewis once said, we are just a bag of mixed motives. We're always have this fight going on within us. And if you want to find it in anybody you might look up to in Scripture, it would be Paul in Romans 7, when he says, I keep doing the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I do want to do. And who is going to save me? Is that not a picture of tension? I know what I want to do. I know what I need to do. Maybe I might even say, I know what I should do, but I don't do it. Or I just say, I don't want to do it. And it's, the interesting thing about that is, for most of us, most Christians, they won't even admit the fact that they don't want to do it. And so they really end up denying the reality of what's going on within them, which reduces the tension, you see. And that's why this is such a big, big deal. Our world is filled with examples of tension. I sit here in the Northern Command post with my microphone, and it has a extendable arm on it, and it's built around springs. And the springs make it possible for it to suspend itself in space without that tension between the weight of the microphone and the weight of the microphone holder. That's awful. The microphone cords and everything else. There is a perfect tension between those things, and it suspends itself in space. And our refusal, I'm firmly convinced that our refusal to deal with tension in our lives and not spend all of our time trying to get rid of it inhibits our spiritual growth and our emotional growth, and even in some levels our cognitive, our mental growth. Because we quit asking questions. We quit leaning into asking questions like, I wonder why this is, and why does this bother me so much? And so that's the tension piece that I want to bring before you. The second one is ambiguity, and that's an even bigger one, I think, that oftentimes comes up. And I would refer you back to a previous podcast I did about the demand for certainty. Because after all, the issue about ambiguity is we live in a world that is ambiguous. How do I say that? Well, I'll give you a really easy example. I was talking to somebody today about conversations, which is not a conversation, but go with me with this one. But it was a conversation over texting, over messaging. Now, that's not a conversation. It is a dueling monologues between two people. And the space between those two monologues is where all the interpretation occurs. And since we don't want to take the time to actually say, wait a minute, I don't understand what you're saying here or what you're texting to me, we just fill in the gaps. And that's where we think we get clarity, when in fact it's not clarity at all. All it is me interpolating, which means filling in the gaps between what they have said and what I believe they have said, and what do I react to, what I believe they've said versus what they have said. I'll give you another really good example. I was listening to talk radio and sports radio, and they were having a conversation because recently, apparently, there was a lot of chatter going on in Denver for a long time about whether or not Aaron Rodgers was going to come, the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, was going to, invoke his free agency and actually come to Denver. And within this last week, he decided to stay in Denver. He got the extension contract, blah, blah, blah. You can figure all that out, or if you're really interested, get into it and look it over. But he did a press conference and announced the fact that he was going to be in Green Bay. And one of the broadcasters that I was listening to really got sideways with some of the things that he said that implied that where he was from was a terrible place to be from, which is mild. I'm being diplomatic. So he interpreted what Rodgers said to mean that where he was from and the football team he rooted for was a piece of crap. And that, of course, the Packers was, the gold standard. And I don't care what your stand on that is. My point is that his reaction to whatever Aaron Rodgers was saying was built on his interpretation of what Aaron Rodgers was saying. Interestingly enough, his co-host said, I would challenge you that if you looked at the transcript, that was not there. But see, this is where our demand for clarity gets in the way of actually communication. So clarity ends up being the threat to actual communication, because we assume we know something that may or may not be true. And so what comes out of this thing of ambiguity is that if I get clarity, I don't need to trust anybody. I don't need to ask questions. I don't need to go into this space that exists between us and live there and ask questions and try to get some understanding, not clarity, but understanding from the other person. You see, ultimately, there's so much that happens within people, and I can tell you from the perspective of being a counselor for as long as I have, that the refusal to embrace the tension of life, the ambiguity that exists in our relationships and in our relationship with God, it contributes to the anxiety people feel. It contributes to our sense of helplessness. It contributes to our sense of vulnerability, because we simply are not willing to sit with that ambiguity. And so it doesn't prompt growth. If anything, it prompts a determination to get rid of it. And yet, the impact that has on our relationships to one another in terms of trust and communication and revealing what we actually think in the real time, and that's something that I refer to as living in the space between us. If you know anything about Star Trek at all, there's always the beginning part of Star Trek, particularly the old ones, and I'm old enough to remember watching them in real time. It says it's the voice of Spock, and he says, "Space, the final frontier." And that is true in the space between each one of us. It is a dangerous place. And in many cases, our efforts is to make it a safe place without necessarily having a connection that allows us to exist within that well. And that tension and ambiguity that is part of that space between us is actually the very thing that grows relationships, but it scares the spit right out of us. And we don't want anything to do with it. And I can tell you that one of the other conversations that I often have around this issue of tension and ambiguity is about integration. How do we live as integrated people? Because one way to remove the tension is to just live compartmentalized lives. In other words, disintegrated lives. And so I have this compartment of school, and this is how I live. This is the behaviors I engage in. These are the values that I espouse. It's all of those things. And then when I'm out of that, I leave that compartment behind, and then I go home or my personal life, and I do certain things there in a particular way, and I espouse certain values, and I go to my friend group, and I get that. And see, that disintegrated life allows us to live with the clarity we demand, but the isolation that we condemn. And that is so much a part of this issue with tension and ambiguity, and even in the spiritual sense, you could use the word mystery, because there's a lot that I don't know about God. I still don't. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. We were in a group. I attend a men's group, and he decided to ask me about kind of how I came to my relationship with Jesus and all of that sort of stuff. And when he heard when I had embraced Jesus as the Lord of my life and the person that I wanted to follow and companion with for the remainder of my life, he said, "You've been doing it all your life." And it's like, and I said, "Wait a minute. No, not all of my life." But for him, his perspective was he accepted the claims of what Jesus had and who he was, and his need to have Jesus as a companion for a spiritual journey, and all that he did on the cross and all he did in his resurrection and the justification by faith and all of that stuff. He came to all of that at 45. And I came to all of that at 18. And in his way of thinking, that was all of my life. And that, here I am much older. And that's probably true. I have spent more of my life walking with Jesus than I have not. And yet, I understand this issue of mystery. And as a matter of fact, it seems like the older I get, the more appreciative I become of the ambiguity and mystery in my relationship with Jesus, partly because it calls me to trust and intimacy and vulnerability, all the things that seemingly for a lot of parts of my life I spent all of my time trying to avoid. And I don't know what your story is. I don't know where you're coming from. All I can tell you about in terms of, and that's why I kind of called this, that's why I called this podcast the monologues, because that's all it really is. It's my monologue on a topic that caught my attention, and if it's going to hit something in your life that it has some meaning or some importance or challenges you or brings things into a little clearer picture, not clarity, but maybe a clearer picture, it's because of what God is doing in both of our lives and how God wants to reach out into people's lives. And my voice happens to be the voice at the time to be able to speak into your life and what's going on within it. And that's the wonder. That truly is the wonder of these kinds of interactions, is that for a brief moment in time, you or me may actually be God's voice in somebody else's life. We don't know that. We're not setting out to be profound or anything like that. We're just interacting and trying to love people well, and I might add, love myself well enough to be able to even receive the love that they might show back to me. And that's a topic for a whole other day that I think I probably need to spend some time kind of unpacking. So, tension and ambiguity, what do you do with it? How do you deal with it? Do you try to reduce it at all costs? Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying, okay, that all tension is okay. All ambiguity is okay. That is not where I'm going here. But I think what I have seen in my own life and others' lives is that our abiding, overcommitment to reducing tension often places us in a position of missing out on something that is waiting to help us grow and to become fully who we were meant to be. And that's really what it's all about. So, food for thought for the evening. I hope you have a good evening. Thanks so much for joining me. A few end of program reminders, as I always say, if you have questions, please look for the poll on my website for some of the new music that I'm trying to use. I'd love to have your feedback. I would very much appreciate it. If you have questions, if I've provoked something in you that you want to find out more about, please DM me the questions on Instagram or leave a comment on the website. You can do that there as well. If you want to subscribe, please do so on the website. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a subscription box. And so any of the new content or content that comes out on the website, you will find out about by subscribing. You'll get an email and remind you of that. You can subscribe and follow the Psych Monologues on Instagram at the Psych Monologues. On Facebook, you can follow me there at ray.mitch, and in LinkedIn, drmitch. The podcast itself is found on any of the platforms that you digest or consume podcasts. So Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Podbean, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts, you would be able to find the Psych Monologues, which is the name that you would be looking for. If you feel compelled and want to partner with us to be able to grow a scholarship fund for students to attend the silent retreat that I and Dr. Saxby, a friend of mine, lead twice and sometimes 3 times a year, which I'll tell you about here in a second. Please, we would be ever so grateful if you were interested in partnering with us. All of your gifts and donations are tax deductible. And so if you want to do that, you can go to the CCU link on the website. There's a drop-down menu. Go to Silent Retreats, and at the bottom of the page, there's a donation button there that you can click on, and you will get a donation receipt that is for a tax-deductible gift to the CCU Silent Retreats. If you'd rather do it through a check, you can do that as well. You would have to make your check out to 1615.tv, 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104. Now, the other thing I want to mention is we have retreats coming up. They are now officially scheduled. We have one in October. This is for active students at CCU. And this one is October 21st through the 24th of 2021. We also have another one, which is really going on a limb for us, for our alums. Not only an alum of the Silent Retreats, somebody who's already done one or two, plus the alums from CCU who want to participate. They may fly in or come in from somewhere else to participate. That alumni silent retreat is November 4th through the 7th. And then finally, we have another one in the spring And again, this is kind of a mixed group. This can be alum or active students. And that is in the April 7th to the 10th of 2022. So there is a great need for students, as you no doubt can imagine, that oftentimes they just don't have the discretionary income to be able to afford going to one of these silent retreats. It's a bargain, in terms of retreats, but that's still a lot of money for students to swing who are trying to work and go to school and all the other things that they're trying to do to be able to get through school. So the cost of a single retreat for anybody who would be part of it is $330. Now, CCU has been generous enough to offer subsidizing for active students of CCU. I would love to be able to have our silent retreats be freestanding and be able to have a robust enough silent retreat fund to be able to help anybody who would like to join us for the silent retreat. So we just have to build it up, and we have a pretty significant kind of deposit coming up that we need to be able to cover, and that is $750, and we're about $240 into that. And so anything that you would be so inclined to contribute and partner with us, I would be ever so grateful. So I think that's it for the evening. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for offering up or participating for a short period of your evening. I pray that the week is one of surprises and adventure and a tolerance of tension to be able to see a remarkable movement of God in your life. As always, love ya. Later. Bye.